Today I'm working on cutting back and dehydrating basil. When I was in the garden today, I noticed that some of my basil is taking over some places I have other plants, and it needs a good trim. So I'm starting out by trimming up this Thai basil. It's delicious, used raw or cooked in recipes like drunken noodles and Thai chicken, and I've never dehydrated it before, so I'm excited to see what the flavor turns out as. Now, ideally, you would pick your basil before it flowers in order to use it for culinary purposes, but the pollinators loved the flowers so much, I just couldn't pick it beforehand. So I've let my basil completely flower, and I'm hoping by giving it a hard prune, it'll flush back and maybe bloom again this season. We'll see. A really neat thing about basil is that when you cut it back, it doubles the growth. Every cut will grow two new branches, and so the more you cut, the more you'll have to harvest later in the season. This basil I'm cutting back now is called blue spice basil. It was a free seed that I got in the mail when I ordered some other Baker Creek heirloom seeds, and so it's my first year growing it. I grew it from seeds starting, I think, in April, and it has been hugely prolific. But it's crowding out my okra, and I really want that to be successful, so I'm going to cut this back a little bit. I did start by using some garden string to try to tie up this basil, but it's so prolific it needs a good cut. I love the smell of this basil. It smells very sweet, and every time I walk into the garden, I can smell it. And this one, especially, the pollinators are loving. In my greenstock tower planter, I have three different types of basil planted. This one is called cinnamon basil. It has a nice, spicy, sweet smell, and I'm going to leave most of it alone so that the pollinators can continue to enjoy these flowers. This is a lemon basil. It's a little bit shaded, so it's not quite as prolific, but I'm hoping that a good cutback will help it continue to produce nice leaves for me to eat. I've got all my basil cut back, and now I'm going to bring it inside and give it a good rinse. That way there aren't any bugs or bug eggs or anything like that left on it. Next, I'm going to be taking my pruners and just snipping off the flowers on the basil. The flowers are edible, but I don't want to use them in this spice blend that I'm making. So I'll go through each one, I'll inspect it, make sure that it looks all clean. I'll pull off any damaged or maybe brown leaves that it has, and then snip off the flowers so that they're ready to go in the dehydrator. Now that the basil is all prepped, it is time to load the dehydrator. I have a ton of basil here, so I'm going to make sure the dehydrator is nice and full of leaves. In fact, I'm probably overfilling it a little bit, but that's okay because it's about 5:30 in the evening and I'm planning to run the dehydrator all night long. If it's still not finished in the morning, I might take some out and dry it for longer, but I really don't want to have to do 2 batches in the dehydrator since it'll take so long. The dehydrator is loaded up and we'll check on it in the morning. The basil has been dehydrating for about 12 hours, and with herbs, it's better to be safe than sorry. If there's any moisture left at all, you'll deal with mold issues and it'll spoil your hard work. So I err on the side of caution and dehydrate it for longer than what it needs to most of the time. So I'm going to gently remove the basil from the top layer of the dehydrator, and now comes the fun part of removing the leaves from the stems. You can also pick the leaves off before you put the basil in the dehydrator, or remove the leaves from the stems afterwards. Either way works about the same. I'm just going to be kind of picking and scrunching the leaves off, and I'll go through each section of the dehydrator, removing the leaves from the stems, and then it'll be ready to jar up. Once I've removed all the stems and separated the leaves on the first tray, I'm going to just make sure my basil is kind of all grouped together, and then I'll use a cooking funnel that I have to help funnel it into this jar. This is a jar that I had bought with another spice inside. I washed it in the dishwasher and I used my Cricut to make the basil label. It might look like this jar is full, but I'm actually going to use the back of a spoon to mix up and crush up the spice. I want to make sure that it's a good size for sprinkling on things and that it will fit through the holes in the top of this container. So I'm just going to mash it up to make it nice and fine. I've repeated the process with all the other layers, Remember that my dehydrator has four trays and layers to it. So the basil jar is almost completely full, and we're going to see if we can fit the rest of what we have in this jar. And I was able to just make it fit and put on the top. Believe it or not, that entire bowl of basil just dehydrates down to making one jar. Now you know why dried spices are so expensive. Thanks so much for watching.